So this section is going to be a lengthy one, but I think it's very important. So we're going to talk about working with immigrant and refugee survivors. So what is the difference between a refugee and immigrant? A refugee is someone who has been forced from their home country by war, civil conflict, political strife, natural disaster, or gross human rights abuses. Immigrant, a person who chooses to relocate from one nation to another, not necessarily to escape persecution or danger. Some immigrants are migrant workers who do seasonal farm work. These are just some of the immigrant populations, but these are the largest ones here in Minnesota. The Hmong are an ethnic group living throughout the mountainous regions of South Asia, in China, Myanmar, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. The first Hmong families emigrated as refugees. More than 60,000 Hmongs live in Minnesota. Somalia is located in eastern Africa, bordering Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, east of Ethiopia. Due to the collapse of the 1991 Somali government and subsequent civil war, thousands of Somali immigrated to the country as their refugees or political asylees. An estimated 50,000 Somali have made Minnesota their home. Karen individuals make up the second largest ethnic group, after the Burmese, in the land that the world came to know as Burma. More than 100,000 Karen refugees in Thailand and hundreds have been coming to Minnesota in the last few years. Ramsey County Sexual Assault Protocol Team. Some considerations. Recognize the courage that it takes for an immigrant to leave their country. Acknowledge the loss of leaving one's country and traditional life and having to start over in a foreign land. Immigrants may face a number of barriers, including economic struggles, immigration status issues, language, family separation, and racism or other forms of oppression. It's very important to not use the term alien because it can be offensive. The term reinforces that an outsider status and negative racial or cultural stereotypes. So, an immigration status. Legal non-citizens. Individuals who have immigrated to the U.S. and have not become citizens. Temporary visitors, employees, or students. Permanent residents with green cards. Undocumented citizens. Individuals who do not currently have legal immigration status. Some enter the U.S. illegally. Others enter the U.S. legally but fail and fall out of legal status because an authorized document expired. Migrant farm workers face a number of factors that increase the risk for sexual violence, including power imbalance between worker and employer, working long hours alone in remote fields or orchards, communal living conditions. Farm workers often are dependent on their employers and supervisors for their basic needs in life, such as pay, transportation, housing, clothing, healthcare, education, legal papers and documents, information, language and translation, and others. Many migrant farm workers live in communal housing quarters called labor camps. These camps are often on the outskirts of town in very isolated areas. They tend to lack the appropriate lighting and do not generally have public phones for workers to call and report an emergency. In addition, their housing requires them to share sleeping, eating, cooking, showering, toiletrying facilities with many other workers. There are some significant barriers to reporting sexual violence from migrant workers. Sexual violence might be part of the quote-unquote deal. Fear of retaliation from perpetrator when that perpetrator is an employer. Cultural, linguistic, and geographical isolation. Lack of mobility and freedom. Some more barriers. Fear of removal from the U.S. Perpetrators often threaten to report victims to immigration authorities if they tell anyone about the sexual violence, and in some situations, the perpetrator actually does have some control over the victim's immigration status. Fear that the perpetrator will be removed. Perpetrators may take children with them if they are removed from the U.S. The perpetrator may provide vital financial support to the victim, which could end with removal. Many immigrants send money to family members living abroad. This flow of money could also cease, causing hardship on individuals the victim cares about. If the perpetrator is removed, the victim may fear retaliation from the perpetrator's family and friends who remain in the U.S. Fear of police or the judicial system. Victims distrust police with their native countries influence their decisions to report and access advocacy services. Victims may assume that you work for the federal government, immigration, and may fear that you will get them or their family members removed. Gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. Women, certain ethnic minorities, and women who identify as GLBTQ may come from countries or situations which they had no rights or protections under the law. All right, language. So victims may not know, especially some of the terminology, if they're an immigrant or refugee, on how to describe what they want or need in a complicated situation. They also may be forced family and friends to translate for them, which is a lack of privacy and how they tell their story and how they express their needs. Cultural and religious beliefs and institutions. Cultural or religious leaders may have pressure victims to submit or to remain silent about sexual violence. Certain types of sexual violence unique to some cultural or religious beliefs may pose a challenge, even for those most experienced advocates. Past trauma. Some individuals who have endured significant trauma, like torture or war, feel guilt of complaining about their treatment here in the U.S. They may feel their experiences here, however negative, to be an improvement over their past. Economic control is a common form of abuse in all cultures, but the effects may be exaggerated or undocumented individuals who cannot legally or work may not be eligible for certain public benefits. This can cause some serious economic strain on the person. So what can we say? We can say, my job is to work with people who have been hurt by crime. I do not work for the government, immigration, or the police. I provide help regardless of your immigration status. You do not have to talk about your immigration status if you are not comfortable. However, some victims of crime qualify for special visas, so I will tell you about some options that could help you. What is it like for you to talk about this problem with your family or in your community? Advocates should never advise non-citizens to disclose their legal status to other agencies or institutions. Advocates should never directly contact CIS or ICE when we're trying to determine if legal status, benefits, or other immigration legal options for a non-citizen victim or survivor. Instead, advocates should contact an immigrant rights agency or an attorney experienced in immigration law. So again, we never want to use children to interpret. Make sure that the survivor feels comfortable with the interpreter. Beliefs, values, and expectations do not interfere with the interpreter's work. And ensure that the interpreter knows the correct dialect. And if there's anybody in the room, especially with a family member, if the victim wants the family member in there. VAWA self-petition eligibility. Victim must be related to the perpetrator, spouse, parent, or child. Perpetrator must be a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, or even a green card holder. VAWA allowed certain victimized non-citizens to self-petition, thus avoiding the need for the perpetrator's cooperation in the immigration process. VAWA consequences for perpetrators. If the non-citizen is convicted of certain crimes, they may be removed from the U.S. Domestic violence offense, stalking, child abuse, a judicial finding violation of protection order, aggravated felonies, rape, sexual abuse of a minor, and sometimes statutory rape charges. U visas. Victims of domestic or sexual violence who are not married or related to the perpetrator or whose perpetrator is undocumented are eligible for the status. For people who have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of having been a victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, or trafficking. T visas. Neither the immigrant status of the victim nor the immigrant status of the perpetrator is relevant to eligibility for a T visa for victims of severe form of trafficking. Immigration law states a victim of severe form of trafficking is any person who has been recruited, harbored, transported, provided, or obtained for labor services or for the purposes of commercial sex act and or has been subject to force, fraud, coercion when made to engage in labor services or commercial sex act. So what can we as advocates do? Know our community resources. Do not refer an immigrant survivor to an agency that is culturally specific automatically. Unless that is what the survivor wants or the survivor has needs from your agency we cannot meet.